This story comes from Mark, a former security guard who worked nights at an abandoned hospital. He never told it for money or attention. He told it because it still visits him when the house is quiet and the clock says 3:13 a.m. He told it the way people confess, not to be believed, but to be rid of it. What follows is his account, as faithfully as it can be told without the chill of his voice and the way his eyes kept flicking to the corner of the room while he spoke. Mark took the job because it paid slightly more than the warehouse shifts he'd been doing, and because nights suited him. He said the world made a different kind of sense after midnight, when the phones stopped and traffic thinned, and you could hear your thoughts walking down the hallway ahead of you. The building had a name once, St. Helena's, though by the time Mark was assigned there, most people called it simply the Old Hospital. It had stood empty for more than a decade. The developer's banner on the chain-link fence promised renovation pending, as if fortune would arrive any day now, wearing a hard hat and carrying good news. On his first night, the site manager walked him through a short list of duties: patrol the main corridors, check the side entrances, log any trespassers, report broken windows, and don't go into the basement without radioing first. The manager smiled as he said that last part, like a half-joke he didn't really want to make. "You'll be fine," the man added. "It's just a building." Mark said yes, though the hospital didn't feel like a building. It felt like a place that remembered too much. The lobby was a hollow shell, the reception desk stripped, plastic fern still in its pot, a corkboard with yellowed notices that nobody had bothered to remove, old tape marks on the floor still outlined where chairs had been. He noticed the way dust arranged itself along the edges of everything, like the building had been exhaling for years, and the air didn't know where to settle. He turned on his flashlight and the beam cut a smooth tunnel through the dim, showing moats floating the way snow floats when wind has nowhere to go. The first round was simple: long corridors, white paint gone the color of old bone, door placards with numbers that felt less like addresses and more like warnings. He passed pediatrics, murals peeling, a faded cartoon whale smiling above a line of built-in benches with gum fossilized beneath. He passed surgery, heavy double doors with circular windows, the kind of doors that only swung in emergencies and never gently. He passed the nurse's station on the third floor and paused. A mug still sat there, chipped at the rim. A calendar pinned behind the counter was turned to a month 12 years gone, a week bracketed with a red marker, Move Day. Someone had drawn a little smiley face in the corner, eyes too close together. Mark logged each station, returned to the lobby, and made himself a coffee from the small machine the company provided in a windowless office that used to be the gift shop. He said he wasn't spooked on that first break. Not exactly. But he noticed how his shoulders ached as if he'd been shivering, and how the coffee felt like more than caffeine, like warmth he owed himself for stepping into all that silence. On his second round, he heard the first whisper. He didn't call it that then. He called it a draft. It threaded itself along the corridor outside post-op recovery, the kind of sound you can explain if you need to, but it had shape. That was the thing that brushed his thoughts backward. Shape. Drafts blunder. This sound glided. He stood still with his light angled downward, listening the way you listen to bad news approach a door, hoping it turns and goes elsewhere, knowing it won't. He told himself it was vents or pipes or a window left cracked in a room he hadn't noticed. He turned the handle of room 3A. The door swung inward. Beds gone, rails still there. Pale squares on the walls where equipment had once hung. On the counter, a single patient band lay coiled, the way a bracelet coils after you've slipped it off. The name had bled away with time, but the date was legible. It was from the same week as the calendar downstairs. He left the band where it lay and backed out with the careful attention you give to things you cannot afford to anger. By 3 a.m, his mind had begun doing the arithmetic that keeps men from feeling foolish. Draft plus loose door equals small noise. Small noise plus long corridor equals large imagination. He walked the route again, this time tapping each door he passed with the knuckle of his left hand, a small ritual he didn't know he was inventing. At the end of the pediatric wing, a call bell pinged once. It was small and almost sweet, like a toy. He froze. He looked up at the ceiling, then down the hallway. Another ping from somewhere to his right. He followed the sound to a room marked 217. The call light over that door was a dull red lens, clouded with dust. It glowed as he watched, then died, then glowed again. On, off, on, steady as a pulse. He thumbed his radio. Control, this is Mark on 3. I'm getting a call signal on 217. Is the panel live? Static? Then the site manager's voice, half awake and making a joke sound like work. Nothing's live in there, Mark. Panels are dead. You sure it's a call light? Mark said yes, stood under the lens, watched it do the work of a ghost heart. He reached for the handle. The door was already open. He pushed with 2 fingers and it drifted inward, slow as if it had been waiting for exactly this speed. The room smelled like paper and something faintly sweet beneath it, the after scent of flowers that had been carried out in haste. On the windowsill, someone had left a deck of playing cards face down, rubber band long since snapped away. He lifted the top card with the carefulness he used at crime scenes back when he wore a different badge. The Queen of Hearts stared back. He placed it down lightly, as if eyes could bruise. When he left 217, the call light stopped. He looked up and waited for it to glow again, almost wanting it to, because the mind prefers a pattern to a question. It stayed dark. As he turned away, he felt the temperature slide, the kind of cold that isn't air but absence. He exhaled and watched his breath go nowhere. He didn't run, not that first night. He did what the living do. He found an explanation he could carry. In the office, the site manager had left a binder with a map of the floors and notes scrawled by the guards before Mark. Most were mundane. East stair door won't latch. Homeless encampment near loading dock. Keep an eye on second floor windows. Kids smash and run. But one note had been scratched out so hard the paper had scarred. Above the furrows, in a different hand, someone had written, "Do not patrol alone after 2 a.m. Calls." The word calls had been underlined 3 times, the last stroke trailing off into a lost thought. Mark's second night did not ask his permission. He told the story like a man who has learned what shapes fear can take and how it behaves when you don't look at it. He arrived at 11, signed in, walked the perimeter, checked the padlocks on the back gate. On his way past the loading dock, he saw a chair sitting in the middle of the concrete, facing the wall. It hadn't been there earlier. He swung his light across the dock, half expecting to find the small scurry of trespassers or the sag of a sleeping bag. Nothing. The chair was the kind with wheels, one leg missing a cap so the metal showed like bone. He moved it to the side with an odd politeness and continued on. At 1, he was on the 3rd floor again. He had developed the habit of talking aloud to the building. Some employees do that, the way surgeons talk to quiet their hands, or teachers soothe an empty classroom before a lesson. Right. He said, I'm here. Let's do this one the easy way. It was a sentence intended for no ear. And yet, when he finished speaking, a door somewhere behind him closed with the soft efficiency of a practiced hand. He turned. The corridor was straight and empty, the kind of hall that belongs more to photographs than to human feet. He walked toward the sound, counting steps because numbers feel like control. At 17, he realized he was passing the same supply closet he had passed at 12. He stopped, turned around, and stood looking at both ends. The lengths didn't match each other in the way halls should. He looked down at the tile squares, at the repeating dots near each seam, at the pattern meant to reassure you that space is reliable. It wasn't the pattern that changed, it was the distance between his breaths. He chose a direction and walked until he reached the nurse's station. The mug was gone. In its place lay a pen, metal, with initials etched into the barrel. HM. He rolled it with one finger. Along the clip, tiny letters had been scratched. "Help me." He put the pen in his pocket without thinking and felt the weight of it grow colder against his thigh as he moved. Around 2, the call bells began ringing in sequence, the way alarms test themselves at startup, but they were not connected to any power, and the startup had been 12 years ago. 210 blinked, then 212, then 214, a slow pan down the corridor as if something were testing the rooms for survivors. Mark keyed his radio and said the sentence trained men say when they need to hear their own voice. "Control, be advised we have a malfunction on 3. Investigating." He opened 210 sheets still folded on the shelves, the thin hospital kind that feels like air has weight. He checked the closet, empty. He stepped to the window and pressed his palm to the glass. It wobbled slightly in its frame. The call bell died. 212 lit up. He crossed back to the hall. The cold flexed again, the way a muscle flexes, not because you tell it to, but because the body remembers. He opened 212. This time the memory arrived first. A metal rail squeaking the way it squeaks when a patient shifts and a nurse leans in to adjust the line of a tube. He spoke aloud. "Nobody's here. You had your time." It was a rude sentence, and the room treated it like one. The temperature dropped hard enough to sting his teeth. He closed the door and stepped back. In front of 214, the coal lens was bright as a wound. He said nothing. He turned the handle, opened the door, and met the kind of quiet that belongs specifically to rooms that have spent more time with endings than beginnings. On the far counter, someone had placed a little plastic egg timer, the kind you twist to set for a few minutes. It was already ticking. He hadn't seen it earlier. He would have noticed that yellow, cheerful shape. He walked over, picked it up, and stared. The dial had been turned to 3 minutes. He set it back on the counter without turning the knob. It kept ticking. After 10 seconds, it chimed, a single silvery note, and stopped. He left the room with the timer still singing in the skin of his mind. This is how the nights climbed his back. No big jump, no monstrous reveal, just small rearrangements of fact until the world you're standing in is next door to the one you arrived in. By the 4th night, Mark had made a map only he could read. He knew which doors would hang and which would try to stay shut, which corners smelled like medicine and which like rain. He also knew when the building would notice him. Somewhere between 2 and 3, the air would thin and the hallways would lengthen and the past would stand up on its elbows and take a look. He began to research in the afternoons, the way men research when they're trying to learn if an unease has a name. He sat at the public library with the local paper on microfilm and watched months spool by like old weather. There was a fire once, West Wing, late at night, patients evacuated under blankets and coats. There were lawsuits, quiet ones, settled out of court. There was an obituary for a nurse named Marianne, whose body was never found after an evacuation drill gone wrong. And there was a story that kept changing depending on who told it. A patient who pressed her call bell and no one came, a child in pediatrics who rang and rang and rang until somebody found the bell yanked out of the wall with little fingers raw. Rumor grows fat in such shade. Mark did not take comfort in any of it. On the 5th night, something moved that should not have moved. He was walking past the old surgical wing when he saw it, a gurney at the end of the hall facing him. These did not belong there. They had been hauled away long ago, sold, scrapped, lost. This one carried no mattress, just a steel tray with rust freckles and a strap dangling like an afterthought. He lifted his light and the beam cut across the tray. In the reflection, he saw a figure behind him. He turned, no one there. He turned back and the reflection had not caught up with the truth. The figure remained in the steel, a tall shape, shoulders narrow, head tilted, as still as overexposed film. He stepped closer until his breath fogged the tray and wiped at the surface with his sleeve. When the metal cleared, his own face looked back, older than it had any right to be. He didn't report the gurney. He learned the language the building would accept, not a threat, not a challenge, only the minimum necessary to keep the job. He logged the corridor as clear and kept walking. The old call bell system turned itself on 2 nights later. It started with a single tone on the 2nd floor, the kind of tone they used to teach the new nurses, press, release, press, release. Then, like a choir assembling itself, the tones came from different wings, not in unison, in answer. He could track them by the echoes. Post-op replied to recovery. Recovery replied to pediatrics. Pediatrics called to the long hall outside the morgue where nobody asked for anything anymore. He stood at the central junction and listened. The building was talking to itself in the only language it had left. He went to the electrical room because that was what a rational man does. The panels were dark. The master brake was locked in the off position with a steel clasp and a padlock whose key hung on a hook no one had touched in months. He checked anyway. The lock was stiff. The key fit and turned, and the switch remained where it was, off. Still, the bells spoke upstairs. He returned to the junction and saw something he would not forget. Down the longest corridor, room after room after room lit their little red lenses in a clean line, one after the other, like the spine of some enormous creature flexing beneath the paint. His fear did not come hot. It came cool and professional, the way it came when he used to answer calls at 3 in the morning and step into the rooms where the bad thing had already happened, and what was needed now was accurate movement. He walked toward the lights and pressed each call cancel button in turn. When he reached the last lens, he raised his hand and stopped. The number above the door was 217. Inside, the plastic egg timer sat again on the sill. It was already ticking. He watched it for a long time without touching it. It chimed when it wanted, and he felt a sensation he could not name, not recognition exactly, but the slow dread of a routine finding you. After that night, he took the pen from his pocket and turned it in his hands. Chem, help me. He considered leaving it in the office, as if names cling to metal the way smells cling to fabric. He carried it instead, unable to explain why, as if bearing it made him less likely to be asked to pick up anything else. He lasted another week. On his last night, a storm flattened the trees along the avenue and drove rain into the seams of the old brick. He arrived soaked to the calves, swore at the weather, and laughed at himself for swearing. He signed in and found the site manager's chair empty and the radio quiet. Perhaps that was the first wrong note. The absence of the small human irritations that keep a place honest. At 1:30, the halls began to change, not in length, but in posture. Doors that usually hung ajar were shut politely. The nurse's station had the mug again, chip and all, as if the building had rewound itself to a night, and someone would return from a round and finish a lukewarm drink. He touched the mug with his fingertips and felt the dry dust yield the way paper yields. He wiped his hand on his trouser leg as if he touched a memory he had no right to touch. 2:15. Somewhere in the West Wing, a child cried once, the quick kind of cry that is breath and sound together. He walked toward it, not because he thought there was a child, but because that is what legs do when a child cries, even after midnight in a place that stares back. He reached pediatrics and saw the cartoon whale in the mural, smiling the same unwholesome smile. The call bell at the end of the hall lit and stayed lit. He did not go to it. Instead, he turned into the stairwell. Halfway down, he stopped. The stairwell did not continue in the way stairs do. The second flight fell into a shadow that was not shadow but interruption. He stood at the landing and looked into it. Air should have moved there. Heat should have at least meant something. Nothing did. He took one step down and felt himself counted. The feeling was precise, like a hand tallying. He retreated, shut the door with the same care you use, placing a sleeping baby in a crib, and leaned against the cool paint until he was sure of his name again. 3 exactly. He knew it by the sense and by the way his watch seemed to weigh his wrist. The hospital made a decision then. Every coal bell on the 3rd floor lit at once. Not a sequence, not a conversation, an alarm. Red lenses glowed and rose as far as he could see. He could feel them behind him too, down the other corridor. He took 2 steps and his radio crackled with static, and he heard a voice he did not know, speaking a language that was not English, and then his own name said softly with the kind of care a mother reserves for a sick child. He turned the volume down and heard it in the air anyway. Mark. He thought of the pen in his pocket and didn't touch it. He did what men do when rituals have failed. He headed for the exit. The corridor narrowed. He cannot explain it differently. The walls presented themselves where they had not been. He walked sideways for a few steps, and then the passage remembered itself and widened. In front of him, the double doors of the main stairwell stood with their round windows black. He pushed with his shoulder, and the right door gave. He stepped through and stopped. On the landing opposite stood a man in an orderly's uniform, too old for this year. The man was tall and thin, and his shoulders were narrow, and his head was tilted. He was very still. This matters. The stillness was not theatrical. It was the stillness of a thought that had stopped midway across a mind and been abandoned there. Mark lifted his light, and it washed across cloth that had no business reflecting. The man did not blink. Mark's heart performed whatever acts it needed to perform to keep him upright. He said, as gently as he could manage, "I'm leaving." The orderly did not answer, but the door beneath him, the door on the next landing down, opened as if by request. Mark began to descend. He kept the man in his peripheral vision because that is where the truth sits when it does not want to be examined. As he passed, the orderly did something that made Mark's future nights. He inclined his head a fraction more, the way men do to the living when they are letting them go. Mark reached the lobby and crossed the old lines where chairs had sat and pushed through the outer doors. The rain had stopped, the streetlight made cones on the pavement, and the fence trembled as if someone had just let go. He turned to look back. Every window on the 3rd floor held a red dot. The coal lenses glowed like a constellation that has found its shape. As he watched, one dimmed, then another, not in panic but in sequence, like a staff rounding on a converted ship at dawn, turning off what had been needed in the night. He did not resign that night. He drove home first, put the pen on his kitchen table, and watched the way the morning came through the blinds and marked it. He slept an hour and dreamed of ticking. At 10, he handed in his badge. The site manager didn't ask for details. He looked at Mark the way men look at someone who has found a limit where they thought there was none, and nodded as if he too had walked a hole that was longer on the way out than it had been on the way in. Years later, Mark still wakes sometimes at 3:13. He says he wakes gently, like a man being called from another room by name. He lies there and listens to the house be a house. He hears the refrigerator click and the heating turn in its ducts, and the car 2 streets over cough into life. If he hears anything else, he does not tell it. He keeps a pen on his nightstand now, a cheap plastic one, not the metal one. The metal pen he threw away on a Thursday he cannot quite recall. He says he threw it into a bin behind the old grocery store, and he did not look to see if it landed. He says he walked away and, for 3 steps, felt lighter, and then felt nothing. He went back to the library once, years after. The microfilm reader had been replaced with a computer. He typed St. Helena's and found photos taken the winter they closed the place, pictures of staff standing outside with their arms around one another, the way people do when a chapter ends and they want to remember themselves as part of something worth the ending. He clicked through, not looking for the orderly, and finding him anyway. In one frame, near the edge, a tall man in white stared at nothing. In another, a young nurse with dark hair pinned too tightly looked directly at the camera as if noticing it at the last second. Her name tag was legible in the caption, Marianne. He leaned back in his chair and blinked until the screen swam. There is no moral to Mark's story. He tells it because it refuses to leave him, and because people who work nights in empty places deserve to be believed when they say that empty places are not empty. He will not tell you the hospital was evil. He will tell you that it was faithful to what had happened there. He will tell you that the bells did not ring to frighten him. They rang because that is what bells do when asked. He will tell you that he was not brave. He was simply present, and that presence is sometimes mistaken for courage when it is really only witness. He does not patrol anymore. He works days in a shop that sells hardware and keys. He likes the sound keys make when they knock each other on a ring, ordinary, bright, accidental music. Sometimes a customer asks if he copies hospital keys, and he says yes, and then he says, "What hospital?" And if they say a name he knows, he nods. And if they say St. Helena's, he looks at their hands to see if they are holding anything metal with initials etched into it. When people ask whether he believes in ghosts, he laughs softly and says he believes halls can hold voices and doors can remember the hand that pulled them closed, and sometimes a building will do what it was built to do long after anyone is left to ask. He says the question is wrong, not do you believe in ghosts, but what do you owe a place that once kept you alive? He says the old hospital still answers calls. He says, if you stand on the street at 3 a.m. and look up at the 3rd floor, you might see a red dot blink on and off, as precise as a pulse. Mark does not go there. He does not need to. The corridor visits him when it has something to say. He lies in bed and waits for it to finish. When it does, he opens his eyes and looks at the dark and says, because habit is a kind of prayer, all right, I hear you. He told this story once, and when it was done, he asked the only question he had left to ask, the one that turns a testimony into a door everyone has to choose to walk through. If a place keeps answering, who exactly do you think is calling?